Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to be here today because I get to talk with my friend, Professor Doug Groothuis, and he has a new book coming out on Pascal, Beyond the Wager. And if you want to learn about Pascal and why he is a very important Christian philosopher, you got to read this book. And to get you ready for that, we get to talk with the author today. So, Doug, thanks for being here.
Thanks. Happy to be back.
And tell us a little bit about where you're teaching because you've got a big move coming up. And so the audience may not know about that.
Yeah. Yes, I've been a professor of philosophy at Denver Seminary since 1993, finishing up my 31st year. And I will be starting a new position at Cornerstone University and Seminary this fall. As they gave me a long title, I can barely remember all of it. It's like Distinguished University Research Professor of Christian Worldview and Apologetics. I think I need two business cards for that
Yeah, that'll take a lot of
title.
ink.
So very grateful to the Lord and legitimately excited about this new possibility for ministry.
Yeah, that'll be great and give you a lot of time for writing.
Well, indeed, I love to teach, so I'll be teaching one undergrad and one graduate course each term.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a research professor, so I'm expected to research and write, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
I always do that,
Yeah.
really, no matter how much I'm teaching.
What
I've
was your
published
load
20.
like at your teaching load like at Denver?
It's three per term, three
Okay.
classes per term, typically. Sometimes I would teach four.
Wow.
Some years ago, I would sometimes teach a full load at the seminary and teach a class at Metro State Community University or Metro State Community College. It used to be, now it's a university.
Okay.
So I love to teach, but I also love to write, and I've
Mhm.
been cranking hard on the books the last couple of years.
Yeah, good. And I actually met one of your future colleagues last week when I was out in Grand Rapids, and he
Oh,
wanted me to ask you a question. I'm going to see if you can guess who it is from the question.
okay.
Was Pascal an occasionalist?
Yeah, he's asked me that question too.
That's what he
Right.
said.
Right. And that's, oh, come on. I'm not remembering his name. He's an expert
Yeah,
on
you don't
John
have to. Yeah,
Locke.
John Marco.
John Marco, of
Yep,
course. Yeah.
yep.
And I said, I've never been asked that question before. I don't think so, but
Yeah,
that didn't come up in the book.
yeah,
Yeah,
right. Well,
didn't come
tell
up.
us what interested you in Pascal. I mean, I think for you and I working in philosophy, it's kind of obvious, but not everyone's even heard of him. So tell
No,
us what attracted you
no.
to him.
Yes, well, I first discovered Pascal in probably 1977 or 78 when I went home for the summer from college, and I was staying with my mom in Anchorage, Alaska, and she and my dad, years before that, like many people in the 50s and 60s, bought the Great Books
Yeah.
collection.
Mhm.
And I had heard a little bit about Pascal, so the books are on top of the fireplace on a long shelf, and I pulled out Pascal and started to read, and it's been a wonderful learning adventure ever since. And
Mhm.
what really captured me at first, I think, was his account of human nature, that we are great and wonderful by virtue of being made in God's image, and we are also miserable because we're fallen and sinful. And
Yeah.
his thesis is that only the Christian worldview gets that right.
Yeah.
Either a worldview says that we are great or we are gods, or it
Yep.
says we're nothing, we just evolved from the slime.
Yeah.
It's like no other worldview gets the juxtaposition correct. And of course, no other worldview or philosophy has the answer to the
Yeah.
human problem, which is the gospel.
Yep. Well, and he's very well known as a mathematician, also very
Mhm.
accomplished.
Well, I think during his lifetime, he was known really as a scientist.
Mhm.
He was an experimental scientist. He was also a technician. He built the first working calculator
Yeah.
called the Pascaline, and he built that to assist his father in calculating taxes.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
And at the time, the idea that a machine could replicate anything the human mind does was quite remarkable.
Yeah.
But in Pascal's understanding of human nature, he said part of us is the order of the body or the machine, and a machine can replicate some of those elements, but of course, a machine cannot have consciousness or agency.
Yeah.
I still hold to that. We've come so far from the Pascaline, but I don't even think
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
AI could have consciousness or agency, no matter how much it may deceive us to that end.
Yeah. Whenever you see an article that comes out from a computer scientist that says this new AI has consciousness, first thing you do is you look, okay, how's he defining consciousness?
Yeah.
And it's always something along the lines of able to imitate humans.
Yeah, and that ignores the first person. That
Yep.
ignores the subjective.
Yeah,
There's no
exactly.
subjectivity to artificial
And that's
intelligence.
what the famous Turing test is all about.
Yeah,
Can an
right.
AI trick you into thinking, oh, I'm talking to a human right now?
Sure, all the
Yeah,
time. That's a
probably, sure.
deception.
Yep.
That's deception. So deception by definition is not an authentic representation of reality.
Yeah.
So that'd be
Yeah.
interesting. That's one thing I have written on is Pascal and AI. Maybe I'll work on that for an upcoming article, something like
Yeah.
that.
I actually just have an article out today in the magazine Christ Overall online about AI.
Oh,
And one of
good.
the things I point out in the article is that whatever else AI can do for us, because I think as you and I as professors, there's some really nice things it can do for us, like make our bibliographies and check our citations, which in the past maybe grad students did. So the grad students are saying, wait a minute, I don't want to be out of a job,
Yeah,
but
right.
it can't make us wise,
No,
and
no, no, no.
we need to get wisdom first and foremost. So any students who
Yeah,
think AI is great because I can use it to cheat, well, yeah, but you're not learning anything.
no. Well, it's interesting you point that out, and I'll be eager to read the article, Owen, because years ago, to hark back to another book, and I just happen to have it in front of me. I wrote this book a long time ago called The Soul in Cyberspace,
Yeah,
1997. Was one of the first critiques of the internet at a time when everybody was just gaga crazy in love with the internet. And I, as a curmudgeon, said, well, wait a minute, I think there's some things we need to be careful of. But I made the distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom.
yeah,
And you can't gain wisdom through any sort of computer
yeah,
program or application or anything else. Wisdom ultimately comes from above. James
yeah.
1, it comes from God, and we need to have a humble and receptive heart and an active mind to gain wisdom and a lot
Well,
of
and what,
experience too.
and I think it's really neat that you and I kind of had landed on the same critique. And I think what people will in the past, the computer scientists will hear that as a challenge. But I think what you and I are saying is a challenge is different in kind. So in the past, they might have said, you'll never have a computer that you can hold in your hand. And the
Mm-hmm.
scientist said, just wait. And now we got a computer you can hold your hand. Or they might say, you'll never have a computer that can imitate human thought. Just wait.
Right.
But wisdom is a different kind of thing. It's apples and oranges. There's a
Mm-hmm.
category difference. So it's not just a matter of just wait, and soon we'll have a computer that makes you wise. Even when Elon Musk's company is experimenting with implants in the brain,
Mm-hmm.
those don't impart wisdom. They just either give back function to somebody who couldn't move a limb, or they're talking about maybe having like a monitor that you see and you can touch things and click the internet with your eyes. So
Right.
none of that's wisdom, though.
Right. Well, I think if you believe that AI can give you wisdom, you need to go back about 50 years and watch 2001: A Space Odyssey and see how
Mm-hmm.
wise Hal is, right?
Isn't that funny how that's 2001 came and went so far?
Yeah, it
The
really
actual
did.
date.
Yeah.
Um, well, so let's jump in. So Pascal, we were talking about him as in mathematics and science. I believe he invented the first barometer as well. Is that right?
Yes, because he was concerned with this idea of whether nature abhorred a vacuum. And the
Mm-hmm.
Aristotelian philosophy said yes, and the Cartesian philosophy said yes. And Pascal said we need to test it. So he devised a test that ended up measuring barometric
Mm-hmm.
pressure. The whole idea of a syringe is actually from Pascal. We take that for granted all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he was so remarkable because he was a experimental scientist, a technician, and also a philosopher of
Mm-hmm.
science. Because unlike the people of his day, he said, if we want to understand what nature can do, we need to go out and test it, get our hands dirty,
Mm-hmm.
devise experiments. So
Yeah.
he wrote something called the Treatise on the Vacuum. And it's really brilliant in terms of what we need to experiment on and what we don't. So he says, the scripture tells us that God created nature, but we have to explore nature to see how nature works.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a pretty significant insight. In fact, Steve Meyer deals with this a lot in his book, Return of the God Hypothesis. This was one of the factors that spurred the scientific revolution in the
Mhm.
West among almost entirely Christian thinkers. And Pascal contributed to that tremendously. And Steve is a great guy, and I had him on Zoom for my class a couple months ago. I said, Steve, you know, I love you and your work, but you left out Pascal in your
Mhm.
book. You have to repent. And I sent him a section of my book and said, Pascal was right up there with Kepler and Newton.
Oh
We've
yeah.
got to experiment because nature is a set of contingencies. What's not contingent is that it's orderly and knowable because God is an orderly and all knowing God. And he put us here to discover the truths of nature, to develop culture
Mhm.
and science. That's part of the creation mandate. But there were certain medieval ideas that actually hindered the development of science to some extent. And of course, it never developed in Islamic nations because their idea of God's will was really rather arbitrary. They didn't have a solid sense of natural law or looking at the contingencies of nature to see what would appear. That's really
Yeah,
a
it seems like
uniquely Christian concept.
historians of science will point to the golden years of Islam and some discoveries, especially in astronomy and mathematics, that came out of those times. I think there was some famous work on optics, but you're right, it didn't become the same systematized thing that we know
Right.
today as modern science.
Right. I don't think they had the theological or the theoretical resources given their theology to develop science the way we saw in the scientific revolution.
Yeah, it always amazes me, and for one of the same reasons as the medievals, their philosophers were Aristotelians, and it always amazes me that it took us humans roughly 2,000 years to simply go outside, drop two objects, and see
Yeah,
if
right.
Aristotle's right. No one
Exactly.
thought to do that for 2,000 years, and that's amazing to
Well,
me.
yeah, it's like an essential philosophical problem when you confuse the a priori and the a posteriori. You really want to keep those categories in the right place.
Yeah, and
Otherwise, it
just
works a lot of mischief.
and for the audience, Aristotle said bigger objects fall more rapidly than little objects, but we know just from dropping objects that objects fall at the same rate, taking out air resistance. So a feather might not fall as fast as a lead weight,
Right.
but taking
Yeah.
that out of the equation, objects fall at the same rate. So that just required a scientist saying, I'm going to drop some
Mhm.
things and see what happens.
Right. And let's calculate the kind of natural law that explains it. So you have the genius of Newton
Mhm.
with all that.
Yeah.
So,
So
you know,
the title directly immediately tells us about the thing that Pascal is known most for in the philosophy of religion. Tell
mhm,
us about Pascal's wager.
right. It's often misunderstood. I'll give you the terrible caricature of it. It goes like this. We don't know if God exists or not. Nobody can know. If he does exist, we're better off if we believe in him because we'll go to heaven than if we don't, because if we don't, we'll go to hell. Let's believe in God. It's hard to do, so let's stupefy ourselves through religious practices. So we psych ourselves into thinking there is a God, just in case there is a God, and just in case that God will bring us to heaven if we believe in him. That is what you often hear, and it is such a horrible, miserable, despicable caricature. So I've got a whole chapter on the wager, and their entire book's on the wager. But basically, what Pascal is doing is it's a dialogue, and it's one of the larger fragments of the Pensées, the thoughts. And he's dealing with a skeptic who is not convinced by the evidence for God, but he's not an atheist either. He says, I would like to believe, but I can't.
Hmm.
So Pascal says, let's look at the what I call the prudential outcomes related to belief. So let's say you believe in God, and he means the Christian God, and that God is real. You gain heaven and you have to give up certain things, but they're really nothing compared to all the greatness of knowing God and eternity. Now, what if you believe in God and there is no God? You give up certain worldly pleasures, but you don't really lose a whole lot. So you do a calculation that has two factors: possible outcomes and cognitive states. Now, the wager fragment is a little difficult to interpret in some ways. Uh, some people think it grants terminal agnosticism. We just can't know whether or not there is a God. So
Mhm.
we're thrown back on prudential reasoning, considering outcomes. I don't think Pascal held that. I think he was dealing with a particular kind of person who was not convinced by the evidence from prophecy or was not convinced by Pascal's argument from human nature. And there are little hints in the wager that Pascal thinks there are reasons to believe. He talks about prophecies and so on. But then he also says, and I think this is quite ingenious, even though it's caricatured, that some beliefs only come through engaging in particular practices. So he says, if you realize you're better off if you believe if Christianity is true, and if there's a chance, a good chance, probably 50-50, that it is true, then you should see if you could engage in religious practices that might eventuate in you believing in the Christian God. So he says, he's a Catholic, he says, go to Mass and so on, and you will find yourself believing, as many others have done. And the worst construction on this is, well, you're just faking yourself out to believe something,
Mhm.
kind of like self hypnosis, maybe. But that's a very, I think, unlikely and also uncharitable reading because there are a lot of activities that are necessary to believe certain things. So if you want to know something about Christianity, it makes sense to read the Bible, attend church services, talk to Christian friends.
Mhm.
Learning skills like in music, you have to
Mhm.
master the scales and master the instrument. Then you understand something about music, you gain knowledge of the musical world. So I try to deal with the caricatures of the wager and I try to situate it in Pascal's overall philosophy, religion, epistemology, and apologetics. And I think once you do that, you find out it is an extremely wise and engaging operation of reasoning. And there's so much more to Pascal than the wager.
Mhm.
That's why I call the book Beyond the Wager, The Christian Brilliance of Blaise Pascal. We've
Yeah.
talked a little bit about his achievements in
Right.
science, philosophy of science, mathematics. He was the first person really to start to work out probability theory.
Yeah, that's right.
That's something we take for granted. Actuarial tables and
Mhm.
insurance, people are always charting probabilities
Mhm.
for outcomes. Pascal was really the man that started to put numbers to probability
Mhm.
questions. Just
Yeah.
brilliant,
Yeah,
brilliant.
and that's kind of the application of that insight to belief in God. Now, some questions that always come about the wager, also I'll throw them at you.
Right.
One, of course, you've kind of hinted at about the sincerity of this person.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but and if it's terminal agnosticism, but one thing I do like about Pascal, and even if it is agnosticism, I point this out to my students that in one sense there really aren't agnostics. And what I mean is there not that there aren't people who say I don't know, but that after you say I don't know, you still live a certain way. And
Hmm.
everybody I know that says I'm an agnostic lives as if they're atheists.
Yeah,
So what Pascal I think is also pointing out is if you don't know, you could also try living like a Christian. Get up, go to church,
that's
and
right.
see what happens. So it's
Right.
interesting that the agnostics they sleep in on Sunday. They don't go to church. They don't go to Wednesday night Bible study.
Yeah.
But they say they don't know. Well, what he's challenging it with us, I think, is why don't you live that way and see what happens?
Well, exactly. And he also has a famous line in The Wager where he says, you can't ultimately be neutral. He says, you are embarked.
Yep.
You're embarked. So if you disbelieve and you go to your grave disbelieving, you have to live with the results of that. You're not neutral after that.
Yeah.
We're all embarked. We're either moving in the direction of God or moving apart from God.
Yeah. And
There's
then
so many significant insights in The Wager. Yeah.
one thing I often hear the wager mischaracterized both by people presenting it, but then that gives fuel to people critiquing it, is that religion is mainly a matter of giving up certain pleasures. And so
Mhm.
the equation in your mind is all right, I got to get up on Sunday instead of sleeping in. I got to miss football on Sunday evening, but, and then you got to give up drinking, promiscuity, drugs. I got to give
Yeah.
all that stuff up, but maybe I'll get heaven, which is a bunch of nice stuff in the end. And
right.
so it's based on a complete misunderstanding of Christianity
Oh,
in the
yeah,
first place.
yeah,
It becomes a kind of a legal or economic transaction where
right.
you're betting maybe in heaven I'll get more pleasures. So that's not what the wager says, though.
No, it really keeps heaven in view. And it's interesting that in the wager, there's no reference to hell whatsoever. There's simply an eternity of an infinitely happy life or losing it. That's how Pascal puts it. But if you read Pascal, you find out that he glories in what I call the excellence of Christ. I have a whole chapter on the excellence of Christ. People don't write a lot about Pascal's Christology, but he said some
Hmm.
extremely insightful and profound things about Jesus and also about the Christian life. You can buy a devotional book of Pascal's thoughts. I mean,
Yep.
try that with Kant, you know,
Yeah. Right.
or Heidegger. Uh,
Yeah. That's
devotional
what's
book, devotional book of Heidegger would be sort of like Dante's Inferno, I think,
yeah.
transposed to German philosophy.
Well, what Heidegger or Kant, who never went to chapel,
Yeah,
that was required at his university, and he was
right.
notable absent, nobly
Yeah, I think
absent.
he would sort of march part of the way there and then
Yep.
peel off at the last minute. He wouldn't go to chapel.
Yep.
But
And then you've got a lot of
Pascal,
philosophers who might speak about
yeah,
Christianity, like Hegel
yeah,
or Emerson. Both of those guys were influenced by the Bhagavad Gita. And so
mhm.
when you start to translate what they mean by their terms, you realize, oh, they're just teaching Vedantic philosophy in the guise of some Christian terms. Pascal's a serious Christian.
He is. And he was part of, he may not have officially been a Jansenist, but
Right.
he was extremely sympathetic. One of his sisters became a Jansenist nun. He did go to a Jansenist spiritual director, and he defended the Jansenists in the
Yeah.
provincial letters. I have a chapter on that. And Jansenism was a critique of Roman Catholicism that was very Augustinian. So they emphasized the sovereignty of God, the sinfulness of sin, and the need to truly follow Christ and not try to legalistically get away with as much sin as possible,
Right.
which is what Pascal accused the Jesuits of doing. And I think he made a pretty strong case for that. So
Yep. Well,
while
and
in the
yeah,
wager,
Jansenism has been kind of
yeah,
compared to the Calvinism.
there were similarities.
Yeah, I had a professor who was Roman Catholic in graduate school, and he knew I was Calvinist in my theological leaning, and he said because he liked Pascal and he liked Jansenism, he said, "Yeah, if I wasn't a Roman Catholic, I'd be a Calvinist."
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had never heard those two things put together like that
Right,
before, but it
right.
makes
And
sense. And
Pascal would not have appreciated that at all. He was certainly a loyal Roman Catholic, but the emphasis on depravity and the sovereignty of God and the seriousness of repentance and really living the Christian
yep,
life was very significant to Pascal. And he gloried in the realities of Jesus. He talks about the happiness of the true Christian and the joys of knowing Christ. So the wager really features eternal outcomes,
hmm
but that was not the entirety of Pascal's
yeah,
thinking about
yeah. I want
this.
to get to some other
Yeah,
stuff, but one more objection you hear is called the many gods objection.
right.
And so the secularists will say, sure, but let's say you believe in the Christian God, but it turns out the Islamic God is real. Now you've made him mad. And maybe
That's
they're both
right.
not real, and the Buddhist version's real. Now you've made
Yeah,
that version mad.
right.
So how does Pascal anticipate that objection?
Well, Pascal is really dealing with a situation where the options are some form of Christianity, Catholic or Protestant, or skepticism. Now, he did write against Islam, and I addressed that in the book. And of course, there were Jews, and he writes about Judaism. So he's really concerned about theistic religions. And I think if you make the wager an engagement that has no evidential support for one religion over the other, then you have a bit of a problem. But if you build in some apologetics for Christian theism, I think that tilts things
Yeah.
towards Christianity. And a lot of my book is Pascal's positive argument
hmm
for Christianity. So if it's just any God might be real, any religion must be real, then you're basically just in a void.
Yeah.
But even then, you would have to go to the religions that have the most severe outcomes.
hmm
And those would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, especially Christianity and Islam, because they both talk about heaven and hell. Judaism will talk about an afterlife, but not all Jews believe in hell and so on. So you could say if you're simply looking at prudential outcomes, you would stick to Islam and Christianity, and you wouldn't worry so much about Buddhism and Hinduism because they teach reincarnation. So let's say you're not enlightened in this life, you have other opportunities
Mhm.
in future lives.
Yeah.
But I don't think we need to read the wager as epistemically indeterminate,
Mhm.
where you just deal with prudence. I think there are a lot of other factors, such as the evidence
Yeah.
Pascal gives from the human condition. He gives evidence from fulfilled prophecy.
Mhm. Yeah.
Uh,
So his wager is not just something by itself. It's building on these other
yeah,
insights, like you said earlier.
right. Right. And also, the wager itself starts out by addressing somebody who simply is not won over by the evidence.
Mhm.
So Pascal gives reasons and evidence for Christian theism, but he realizes not everyone is going to be won over. So, what if they're not? Do we still have anything to offer?
Mhm.
And we do prudence and what you could call a religious or a devotional experiment.
Mhm.
We still have that. As long as it's not absurd to believe in Christianity,
Yeah.
then you consider prudence, and then you consider the possibilities of coming to an experiential knowledge of God through
Yeah.
religious activities. And of course, we have this great tradition of the argument from religious experience,
Yeah.
which I've written about in my book, Christian Apologetics.
Yeah. And I think and just to define the term absurd, to say believing in Christianity is absurd, absurd means has a direct contradiction within itself. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean seems difficult to me to believe. So you might say, wow, it seems really hard to believe the Red Sea could be parted. True, but that's not absurd. It's within the realm of possibilities. But if Christianity or any religion teaches that there are square circles, well,
Yeah.
that's absurd.
Right. Or if it teaches that um, God is absolutely unknowable. Now, some people
Mhm.
read the prologue to the wager that way. So I address that. If God is completely beyond knowledge, then we can't make any bets at all. We can't engage in any
Yeah.
activity that we think would be in line with God's will or conducive to our salvation. And there's a way of reading the wager that puts it in that category, but that doesn't fit the overall epistemology of Pascal. He very much took human reason
Mhm.
seriously. And when he said, the heart has reasons that reason knows
Yeah.
nothing of, he didn't mean some kind of irrational religious experience. He basically meant what philosophers call rational intuition. So there's some things we know not by empirical experience, not from the a posteriori, but the a priori.
Mhm.
That's what he meant by reasons of the heart. And then people take that
Yeah.
fragment and they say, oh, Pascal's an
Mhm.
irrationalist. He thinks the human mind is
Yeah.
incapable of the knowledge of God. And I say, come on, read Pascal. Don't give me this silliness here. And I'm holding back some nasty words. Don't give me this silliness about Pascal. Read him and then tell me that he doesn't think reason has any power to know the truth.
Yeah.
It's not true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. But it's interesting. He had a religious experience
Yeah.
on a very specific day. I think it was November 23rd, right? And this ex-
1654. Yeah.
this experience changed his life. And what came out of it specifically was that he said he believes in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
And he contrasted that with the God of the philosophers.
Right.
Now, you and I are both natural theologians, meaning that we study how we can use the creation, how the creation reveals God, and all the works of God reveal him. And so I know someone who's in favor of natural theology might hear that negatively, but tell us a little bit about I have some thoughts of my own, but I want you to go first.
Sure.
Tell us your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, this is an experience that he never told anyone about. And he wrote it down on a piece of paper and sewed it into one of his jackets. And after he died, they found the jacket and they found this receipt of a profound spiritual experience. I won't read the whole thing, but it starts out from about 10:30 in the evening until midnight. Fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of philosophers and scholars. Certainty, certainty, heartfelt joy, peace, God of Jesus Christ. And it goes on for some time. Now, there's a lot to say about this. Pascal did not embrace natural theology. I mean, we know that. In fact, I wrote my entire doctoral dissertation on why Pascal rejected natural theology. And I concluded that none of his arguments were cogent. However, he was so brilliant that even though he bracketed natural, well, he didn't bracket it, he rejected natural theology. We could bracket natural theology and still appeal to Pascal and have a very robust apologetic,
Mhm.
like his argument from human nature, fulfilled prophecy, uniqueness of Jesus, resurrection. While we're both ardent advocates of natural theology, I've got
Yeah.
about 250 pages on it in Christian apologetics. You can still build a very strong argument for Christianity without necessarily using natural theology. So I have a chapter in the book called To Prove or Not to Prove, where I pretty much summarize my dissertation and give a lot of references to my academic articles on
Mm.
why Pascal rejected natural theology. I don't think they're good arguments, but there's still so much left in
Yeah.
Pascal. And the idea of God of the philosophers versus God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I think the best way to view that is how much can we know about God just by natural reason and science? And then how much do we need to know through special revelation?
Mhm.
And it's a both and.
Yeah, and I think the way I've taken it, and tell me your thoughts, think if this is accurate, but one way to read Pascal is that he is bracketing natural theology to mean what people who identify as natural theologians have done, or the God of the philosophers. And so, especially, he's thinking about the medieval days. And the medievalists thought that Aristotle and Plato believed in God. Now, Plato believes in the demiurge,
Mm-hmm.
who's co-eternal with matter. Aristotle believes in something called the unmoved mover that's not conscious of humans, didn't create humans, does not providentially rule in the world.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
in that sense, I think he's 100% right. But what he's pointing out is not that we don't need natural theology, but that these guys failed to do natural theology because much more is knowable, and we should know it. Romans 1 tells us the eternal power and divine nature of
Mm-hmm.
God are
Mm-hmm.
clearly known. And so I kind of like to say that the whole Westminster Shorter Catechism question 4, which is what is God, is knowable from creation. God's a spirit, infinite, eternal, unchangeable, and being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. You can know all that from creation, but he's right when he says the philosophers haven't done that. They've been happy with Aristotle. And I still bump into Christian philosophers who
Yeah.
say, yeah, Aristotle's as far as we can go.
No, I think Aristotle gives strong arguments for telos in nature,
Mm-hmm.
and Plato is very helpful in terms of there is an immaterial realm.
Yeah.
I'm kind of a Christian Platonist in some ways. I don't know if you are or not, Owen, but uh, we can go far further than that just on basic knowledge of intuition and observation of nature. And then natural theology has progressed tremendously
Mm-hmm.
since the days of Aristotle and Plato or Descartes. We've got all the scientific arguments from fine tuning and Big
Mm-hmm.
Bang, and the moral argument's been developed very richly in recent decades. And I think there are at least three versions of the ontological argument that are very profound
Yeah. Yep.
and successful. And I talk about that in Christian apologetics too. So I
Mm-hmm.
think you can take all the great arguments for Christianity from Pascal and then add to that the natural theology done at a very high level, analytically, very convincing, and just amplify the whole case. So Pascal didn't use natural theology. He still had a strong case without it. Now we add all this natural theology to Pascal's
Yeah.
insights, and the case for Christian theism just becomes astronomically better at that point.
Yeah. Well, and the only thing I'd add to that again is from Romans 1, though, even before there were scientific
Yes,
proofs,
yes,
all humans from the very beginning of
right.
history have been held responsible for knowing God. But
Absolutely.
you
Yeah.
mentioned special revelation. I think that is part of the key here. And what he means by God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is God who redeems sinners.
Right,
And so tell us a little bit about that. How does he get us into the Bible?
right, right. He says that uh, revelation is not against reason, but above reason. And he doesn't mean that it reveals or causes us to believe absurdities or contradictions. But basically, is that revelation is a source of knowledge beyond what we could know given unaided human reason or human experience.
You have to be told.
So,
You have to be told by God directly.
right, right. We need the word from God to tell us ultimately who we are. In fact, in his argument from human nature, he says that we are mysteries to ourselves until we really listen to God. So we need to listen to God, that we're made in God's image, but we're fallen, and we need to be redeemed through the work of Jesus Christ. So his argument, which I call the anthropological argument, is kind of a one-step argument for Christianity. He says we've got a biblical understanding of who we are as humans. We're great in our intellect and our creativity and our ability to do science because we're made in the image and likeness of God.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also miserable. We're also fallen because of sin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you see this juxtaposition of greatness and misery. He calls this the greatness of a deposed king.
Mm-hmm.
So I talk about deposed royalty. And in his day, he's interacting with people like the skeptics, like Montaigne and others, who said we can't really know much of anything. Humans are stranded in a world of unintelligibility.
Yeah.
Now, Pascal took that seriously, and I have a chapter on skepticism, but he said knowledge is possible.
Yeah.
So we're not just helpless beings in a meaningless world, but on the other hand, we're not God. So the Stoics said that we were one with a universal impersonal God. So
Yeah.
they're wrong. They too highly estimate us, and the skeptics like Montaigne and others have too low a view of who we are.
Yeah.
And we could cash that out in terms of religions he doesn't directly address, like Buddhism,
Yeah.
Hinduism, Taoism, and so on. So he says the biblical account is not just there is a God and God created, it's there is a God and God created us in his image and likeness, and human beings fell into sin. And he thinks the doctrine of original sin, while in some ways mysterious, explains us to ourselves better than any other
Yeah.
account.
Yep.
And we get that directly from the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
It's we get what you were saying from nature and rational intuition, but the redemptive story
Yeah.
and the fall into sin and the possibility of redemption through the work of Jesus Christ is something we
Yep.
need to we need to know through special revelation.
Yeah. And that's why special revelation is sometimes called redemptive revelation.
Right.
And that's, as you said, not something we can deduce ourselves from creation. But when we're told it, we still use reason to read the Bible. So it's not contrary to reason, but it's not deducible from nature.
Right.
Now, when he just talks about miracles and he relies on miracles, one thing I notice that the atheist brings up, but Pascal does not commit this error, but the atheist would point out how miracles can't prove that God exists, that they're already assuming that God exists. And I think that's important. I do think there's something to that, to say you don't really use a miracle about whether or not God exists, but you use a miracle in the context of proving that there's the Bible, the authority of the Bible. And you have a
Mhm.
great chapter just on that, about miracles and different kinds of
Right.
miracles. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Yeah, Pascal wrote quite a bit about miracles, and I really appreciate his definition. He says that a miracle is where a supernatural agency accomplishes what nature on its own could not accomplish. So the effect exceeds the causal power of the natural material world.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that understanding of miracle, you don't have any talk about violating laws of nature.
Yeah.
And that's something we sadly inherit from David Hume. And even Swinburne defines a miracle as a violation of natural law.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the right way of understanding it. I think natural laws are put in place by God,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not the whole system. God is free to intervene and
Yeah.
bring about the virgin birth or part the Red Sea or raise Jesus from the dead. But the natural laws are functioning as they always do, but they don't explain everything.
Mm-hmm.
And laws don't have causal powers anyway. They're
Yeah.
really they are signs of how things are regulated,
Yeah.
natural, orderly events, regularities. So Pascal says that miracles uniquely accredit Jesus, such as his fulfillment of prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
And I've found that recent books on Pascal typically don't talk about prophecy because I think a lot of modern philosophers are embarrassed by this.
Hmm.
Well, that's a pre-modern kind of mythical understanding of nature and history. These kind of things just don't happen. Now, Pascal didn't develop his argument from prophecy in a lot of detail, but he does give a lot of examples of it, going from the Hebrew Bible to the New
Hmm.
Testament, particularly Jesus. And what I do is I sketch it out as a design inference. So if you say that a prophecy is clear, we know what it predicts, and it's a predictive prophecy, not just a thematic prophecy.
Yeah, yeah.
If it's predictive, clear, and if you have a good record that it occurred, and if it was clear and antecedently improbable and it specifies an event, then I think you can run a design inference and say this is evidence of providence.
Yeah.
So he engages in that with the person of Jesus. And then he also compares Jesus with Muhammad.
Hmm.
And I've got a chapter on Pascal on the Jews and on Islam, which is typically not addressed in studies of Pascal. And what he says about Muhammad, basically, he was neither foretold nor did he foretell. He's not a prophet. He's
Yeah.
not a prophesied prophet the way Jesus was. And he didn't prophesy anything or anything that came true. Jesus was both foretold and foretelling. And basically, Muhammad is neither foretold nor foretelling, nor did he work any miracles. So, why should we believe Muhammad's testimony about Jesus and the gospel when we have all the evidence and arguments for Jesus?
Yeah. And I think one of the criticisms of miracles is, well, what about other religions? And so
Mhm.
you're right. That's not really a big part of the Quran.
No.
But some might say, well, sure, but there are Roman emperors who said they were born of a virgin, and the Egyptians believed Osiris came back from the dead. But I think Pascal heads all that off because when we're looking for miracles, I think he's really doing what Moses told you to do in identifying a true prophet. Moses said there's two parts. Do they
Yeah.
speak in the name of God? And that doesn't just mean thus says the Lord. It means that you know who God is. You're not speaking in the name of Baal or Osiris or Zeus, which are
Mhm.
idols. You're speaking in the name of Jehovah. And then they have a miracle that indeed comes to pass. So
Right.
Moses leaves it open that there could be people who do miracles, but they're not in the name of the Lord because he'd
Yeah.
experienced that himself with the priests of Egypt.
Yeah.
And so just because a miracle does happen, that's not enough. And
No.
so the criticism that says, but there could be miracles in other religions, I know, but those other religions deny Jehovah.
Right. Yeah. You're talking about Deuteronomy 13 and Deuteronomy 18, the tests of a true prophet. And Jesus passes both of those tests. And there's also the evidential conditions. So you've got miracle stories about Buddha that show up 500 years after he was born, and they don't read like historical accounts the way the Gospels read. And moreover, the miracles related to Buddha are not of any salvific concern.
That's right. It's
Whereas
not redemptive
biblically,
revelation. Yeah.
no, not at all. So the miracles that Jesus worked, primarily the resurrection, is absolutely fundamental to the whole religion, and it
Mhm.
singles out Christianity from all other religions.
Yeah.
Think of 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul appeals to the witnesses and talks about the fact that if this isn't true, Christianity is untrue, we're deceiving people, we have no hope, etc. So Christianity, to steal a phrase from Butterfield, sticks its neck out on history,
Hmm.
and sticks its neck out on miracles.
Yeah.
Whereas if there are miracle claims in other religions, they're not evidentially credited, they're not evidentially verified, or they're just incidental to the claims the religion happens to make. And with
Yeah.
Islam, the only miracle you have supposedly is the Quran itself. Supposedly, it's so wise and beautiful that only a God could have inspired this.
Yeah.
And
Muhammad was illiterate,
yeah,
supposedly. And so how could he have written such a thing?
yeah. Well, when I look at the Quran, I say, well, first of all, it contradicts the best sources we have about Jesus and the early church. and I have no reason to believe that it's true and the New Testament is false. And secondly, supposedly it's so beautiful in the ancient Arabic, only a God could inspire this, but simply because you take something as beautiful or if the words are euphonious, that's not an adequate test of truth at all. There's a
Yeah.
beautiful side to evil in many cases.
Yeah, and I think the level of historical criticism that's been aimed at the Bible hasn't yet been aimed at the Quran. It's been given kind of a pass
Yeah,
in terms of what's the earliest Quran we have. It doesn't go back very far, but
right.
we've had Christians have had the Bible scrutinized mainly with an attempt to show that these miracles were written in
Let
hundreds
me
of
shut,
years later.
let me shut the door. My dog is
Oh yeah.
voicing his concern about the Quran. So,
Well, we have scholars for the last 2 centuries have spent their
right,
time saying the Bible must have been written at a very late date with people who never met Jesus, and they're just adding in these miracles. And time again, they're shown to be false. We have very early accounts,
right.
eyewitness accounts about what's being written.
Oh, yeah. And also with Islam, there's an incentive not to engage in that kind of research because Islam is famously intolerant of criticism. So it tends to shut down the critics.
Yeah.
But
So
with
then,
the
so
scriptures, yeah,
well, miracles then coming back to the bigger topic of miracles, they occur
yeah,
within the context of already knowing we need special revelation, and we're wondering how do we know which is. And Pascal, I think, is correctly using miracles to
yeah,
say, well, that's what confirms the Bible because of these
right.
miracles. It confirms who Jesus is, and as you said, especially the miracle of the resurrection. Although there are mythic accounts like Osiris. Osiris isn't said to be a historical person. There's
Mhm.
really no similar account like this, and certainly not
No,
within the context of you already know God the creator exists, you know humans are in sin and alienated from God. This is the only account that explains how to be restored to God then.
it is. That's right. Absolutely. And I think Pascal gives us a lot of very strong apologetic material
Mhm.
on the nature of the human condition, that we need to be redeemed, that Christ alone is the Redeemer, and that is verified through his life, death, resurrection, and ascension. So I've got two chapters on Jesus, and this book, Beyond the Wager, is basically an update from a previous book called On Pascal that came out 20 years ago. It's got a
I had
number
that
of
one too.
good for you. You were probably just in college when that came
Yep.
out. But I've got two chapters, Jesus Christ, Miracles and Prophecy, and then a chapter called The Excellence of Christ. And I enjoyed and really benefited from writing those because Pascal had so many insightful, just brilliant things to say about our Lord, about the reasons to believe in Jesus and what he did, what he accomplished through his life, his cross, his resurrection, and who he is today and what he offers us, which
Yeah.
is meaningful life, rational fulfillment, eternal life, hope through suffering. Only that can
Right.
be offered by Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Amen.
And Pascal was a follower of Jesus Christ, no question.
Well, and I think that's another really important element of his religious experience and what he says about the God of the philosophers, because I think you and I have probably both been around people, graduate students, other professors who treat God's existence like a logical puzzle, the way you might treat a Sudoku or a crossword. And you just want to try to figure it out, but you're not personally in love with God. You're not
Yeah.
looking to Christ as your savior. You're just doing mind games. And I think that's something else that Pascal's calling us to is to say your life
Mhm.
should be transformed. You should be enraptured when you come to
Right.
understand your
Right.
salvation. And that should completely and fundamentally change you the way it did Pascal.
Right. And there are many statements in Pascal to that effect.
Mhm.
And I try to give many of those. One thing I added to the book, which I had fun doing, is I set up the very last chapter is a dialogue between Descartes and Pascal.
Hmm.
And of course, Descartes had his arguments for God's existence, and actually, I rather like them.
Some of them are
A
good. Yep.
lot of people who, yeah, a lot of people poo-poo them. I think they're actually very profound. But one thing you don't find in Descartes, whatever his own religiosity was, you don't find that sort of passionate commitment
Mhm.
to Christ that you
Yeah.
read
Yep.
Pascal. Maybe it was there, maybe it wasn't, but it's definitely obvious and verifiable in Pascal's
Yeah.
writings.
Yeah. So really want to thank you for our discussion and taking this
Welcome.
time, and tell everybody, get this book if you want to know about Pascal and how he contributed to Christian philosophy, but also if you want to just engage in really good apologetic arguments and learn about why Christ is needed in your life. If you're someone who already knows Christ, this will help build your faith. If you're someone who doesn't know Christ yet, maybe you don't know what that's all about, I think Pascal will be a good place to start in thinking about why we need Christ to save us from our alienation from God and be restored to a relationship with God. So thank you for joining me, everybody.